Greetings. I'm here today to discuss building a rich lab environment. And this can be in your home or in the corporate office, but I really have more of a home focus in this engagement. So let's start off by discussing the hardware and operating system that I'm choosing to use. I have a pretty beefy workstation with 128 gigs of RAM and 3 solid-state hard drives. I intend to get a fourth one later. And as far as the host operating system is concerned, I'm using a Windows Professional operating system. And the reason I'm doing this is it gives me the flexibility to add Hyper-V if I choose in the future and run that level 1 hypervisor, which gives you a pretty good amount of stability, and you can tap into the resources on that workstation a little more fluidly. But I can also run hypervisors like a VMware Workstation. And VMware Workstation gives me the flexibility of nesting other hypervisors. So in this scenario, I could take and split my 128 gigs of RAM out and, let's just say hypothetically have 2 Hyper-V host servers that are clustered, and I can see what failover cluster looks like with that. In addition, I could have a VMware ESXi host server, and I could set up VMM and manage VMware and Hyper-V. So there's a lot of flexibility there. Now, there are some cons for running VMware Workstation. It is an application. I find that maybe it's not quite as stable. That's not to say that it's unstable. And when we talked about, more fluid management of the resources, you'll see that when we come to memory, I'm not able to give as much of the memory out to the VMs as I might be able to with Hyper-V. Now, what I do think that VMware does well, possibly better than Hyper-V, is the virtual network. So this is where we can really set up our virtual segments. You can choose to have them use DHCP if you desire. I mentioned that I'm using SSDs as my storage, and in the past I've had a couple enclosures with 4 drives each, and I could really get to the 5 to 10 terabyte range pretty effortlessly. So as those drives continued to crash when I would set them up in a stripe, I decided to start buying higher speed storage. Now, as a result, I've only got 2.5 terabytes of SSD storage. So I had to adapt to that environment. Now, one way to do that is through differencing disks and linked clones. So essentially what this allows you to do is to create a machine, load an operating system, prime it with all the applications and the Windows updates that you would so desire, and then you sysprep that machine, and then what you'll do going forward is spin off VMs that have differential hard drives, if you will. So the primary OS might have 40 gigs used. However, you spin off a DC, and that DC might have 4 gigs for the operating system until you install more OS updates and whatnot. But it should still be a fraction of the space in comparison to 40 gigs for every DC. So Hyper-V and VMware can do this. I'm going to discuss the Hyper-V aspect of it first. And so we have what's called a differencing disk. So if we create a new virtual machine, let's just do utils01. And I'm going to go ahead and do dynamic memory. Utils01 is on the VMware Network 1. And we're going to attach a virtual disk later and hit finish. So initially the Hyper-V host is allowing to consume far too much memory for the guest machine. So we're going to go ahead and lower that. This is more of just a best practice to enable the guest services. I find that in my nested hypervisor in its current iteration, enhanced view is not working. I may need to bump up to VMware Workstation 12, but it's a good idea to check that nonetheless. So we're going to create a new virtual hard disk. We're going to choose differencing. Then we'll go ahead and place our hard drive, and then we'll choose a differencing disk. And like I mentioned, I've primed several differencing disk OSs. We're going to choose 2012 R2 Enterprise. I put them in a differencing disk folder, and I label them differencing disk. You cannot edit the differencing disk once you've got a chain of disks off of it. It'll pretty much destroy the entire chain of virtual machines. In this case, that would be all of these machines. So let's look at VMware Workstation's version of differencing disks. So essentially what you do is you set up your virtual machine, you install all the patches, and just a word of caution, you really want to pay attention to the hard disk size, because once you've created a link clone, you are unable to expand the hard drives. This is not a limitation of Hyper-V. You can expand the hard drive of a differencing disk, but in VMware, you cannot expand the hard drive of a linked clone. So once you get your virtual machine prepped, you can enable templates. And what you do is you create a snapshot. So let's make sure I don't already have a snapshot. All right, so I don't. So we're going to take a snapshot. We're going to call it linked clone. All right, so here's our linked clone snapshot. And then what we can do is we can do clone. And we can do an existing snapshot, so link clone. And then we're going to create a link clone instead of a full clone. Now you can go either way. If you need the flexibility of expanding the hard drive and whatnot, and this is going to be a machine that's persistent, you might choose to do a full clone. However, you don't get to take advantage of the storage saving by doing a link clone. So here we're going to do a link clone, and let's just call this Windows Client 10. And I'm going to put it in the virtual machines folder. So here we'll see that this link clone has a different icon than the other template. That just signifies that it's a link clone. So we'll go ahead and start it up, and what we're going to see is something very similar to the differencing disk. Now let's go ahead and switch back to the Hyper-V. So here we go. We're at the UBI, and we can skip, accept. And so we've spun up a new system with minimal effort in the nested Hyper-V. Alright, so let's go back over to our linked clone. So, similar process, it's spinning up now. And as we discussed, the primary difference between VMware and Hyper-V's implementation of this is that Hyper-V gives you some flexibility to expand the differencing disks. So let's go on to another point of discussion, and that is setting up critical infrastructure machines to be Autostart. So in the case of Hyper-V, we can go in and easily choose automatic start action, always start this machine. We can tell it 5-second delay, and we can choose to do so for whatever machines make sense. Most likely DCs for the lab environment that you're using the most. Now this is a little more challenging with VMware Workstation. With VMware Workstation, the only way to have a VM auto start is to create a shared VM. And the shared VM concept appears to sort of set itself up in a local database or repository. So we do have the flexibility of auto starting these shared VMs. Now, the disadvantage to that is that from what I've encountered, all the storage needs to exist in this shared environment. So in the case of my Hyper-V host server, I have some commodity storage that I've set up for Veeam backups. So in that case, this seems to disqualify the auto startup, which isn't a problem, simply because I've set up this VM that has Windows Server Essentials. So if my home system were to crash or blue screen for some reason, at the very least, my router, my RAS server, and my domain controller will come back up with the home server essentials. So I could either set up the client on my host server, or I could jump in from the lab RAS box RDP in to the host, and then start up my Hyper-V host or other VMs that I am not able to do as shared VMs. Let's take a look at one other aspect of the lab environment. I chose to buy the full version of this when I started really relying on my lab environment, and what I'll be able to do now is different scenarios where I can back the entire lab environment up. I can, if I want to, I can upgrade the operating system in Fabricam, or I can, set up a scenario where I delete a bunch of, Active Directory containers or objects and then restore them. And then with quick agility, just put the lab back to the state that it was in before. So there is a free Veeam backup tool that you can use. The disadvantage there is that you have to back up one machine at a time. If you're not doing a great deal of tasks that require you to refresh your lab environment, then you could get by with just using the free Veeam tool and just backing up a system at a time. But as you can see here, it's a really nice tool that allows you to back up your VMs. It even backs up the Linux VMs that I'm running. So the way that I would accomplish doing something similar with VMware Workstation is that you can go to File and you can export to OVF files, which tend to work really well. I hadn't had a great deal of success with doing so from the link clones, and my Viata router, I've not been successful with backing that up to an OVF file. I'd have to look into that a little further. So another topic of discussion is how do you get your virtual machines that are using host-only connections to speak to the external world. So what we have is we have one external Ethernet connection and then a bunch of host-only connections. What I am doing is using a tool called Viata, which is a Linux-based router. The reason I'm using Viata, it sort of gives you exposure to what a real router would be like. So, we can do like show interfaces, Ethernet. So it's showing us the various interfaces. Now, with VMware Workstation, we're only allowed to have 10 network connections. I learned how to set up the web interface by going over the command line examples on YouTube. So what we have is, you've got your system where you can put your primary router, which is for facing on the internet. Then you set your interfaces up. You need to set the first one up within the command line. Then you can go through and set the other IP addresses up for the interfaces. You can set up your DHCP server if you so desire. In order to get to the website, you have to set this HTTPS service up. Then the last part is NAT. So you need to make these NAT rules. And so what we've got is source, the 1.0 subnet mask. And then when we come up here, we're doing masquerade through Ethernet 0, which is my forward-facing interface. So the neat thing about this is, when you make changes to it, it's very much like a real router. You set, and then you can commit or discard the changes, and you have to commit them, then save them to memory. So another thing within Hyper-V that we can do to make our lab environment seem even more robust, if we go to the settings on the network interface, we can enable bandwidth management. I want to simulate having a T1 at these environments. We can go in and sort of craft some traffic. Maybe we say this one is like set up to ISDN or something, and this will give us an ability to shape the traffic on each VM. The final topic that I would like to discuss with you is just managing your infrastructure as a whole. Let's go back to the host server for this. So SolarWinds has a free IP management tool, and we would want to choose either our Hyper-V host server or the actual host operating system, since it has exposure to all the interfaces. And then we can scan, and this will help you keep your IP addresses in order. And we can do things like take notes. We can do these reserved. Combination of the IP tracking and the Visio will help you to ascertain what resources are where. Sometimes in a lab environment, it's essential to find a VM of a certain operating system, for instance. Or if you're sharing out this environment with other folks, it's good to have it documented. The last bullet point would be, set up differencing disks for each operating system fully patched that you might have to spin up in your environment. So, I've got a whole host of operating systems that are baked in the event that I need to test a scenario. Like maybe at work, you're running Windows Server 2012 or 2008 R2, and your boss says, well, we want to upgrade to Server 2016 in the future. Look into the steps necessary. You could then come in your lab environment, spin up the technical previews, and go through all these steps before you have to do it at your workplace. Or if you want to, see what the latest System Center or SCOM is all about. Just an endless amount of possibilities for certification and or lab reproduction that can really help you out to either do a break-fix scenario or to learn a technology. I know this is probably a lengthy conversation, but I hope it's been valuable in showing you the pros and cons for using Hyper-V and VMware. And I would encourage you to use both if you would like to gain some insight on cross-platform compatibility.